Right now, the problem is not around building models, but commercializing AI. You're constantly thinking about like what helps you survive. With AI, you don't want a couple of things. You want to own your data.
Machine learning and data form the backbone of artificial intelligence. My guest today, Apoorva Pandhi, Managing Director with Zetta Ventures, is one of the most knowledgeable investors that I know in this space.
In the market, even today, analytics is so disconnected from machine learning, and machine learning is so disconnected from AI. It's not just a structural shift in terms of technology. None of the companies start as platforms.
As a pure business model, that's a hard one.
Which kind of open source projects can evolve into commercial and meaningful companies? I don't think it's dead. I think SaaS stands for something deterministic. The benefit of open source has always been that you are able to like find users in the wild. The other big opportunity is...
Hi, Apoorva. Welcome to the show. Thank you for making it today.
Thanks for having me.
Very excited to have this conversation. So, obviously we know each other professionally, our firms know each other, but for our audience, it'll be great to just hear your background quickly. You have a very interesting background, and then we'll roll into Zetta's background here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zetta is my third chapter in venture. Prior to this, I've had stints at Foundation Capital and Lightspeed Ventures almost a decade back. And across the board, I've always focused on early stage, particularly seed stage investing. And I've done a lot of investments in data infrastructure and AI infrastructure, but increasingly focusing on the emerging AI native applications. I do a lot of horizontal AI native applications, but I've also been personally very intrigued by healthcare AI as well as legal tech, just because I'm surrounded by doctors and lawyers in my family. Apart from that, I'm an engineer by training, went to IIT Delhi, and also spent one couple of years operating, first as a founder, and then leading go-to-market at a NLP company. By NLP, I mean natural language processing company called Quid, which competed with IBM Watson and Palantir back in the day. And they were applying unsupervised learning to unstructured data. And this predated the transformer era. So it was pretty interesting because at that time, technology wasn't baked out, and we had to deploy forward deployed engineers alongside the product, and we've seen kind of that trend come back. Angel investing took me back into venture when I was in operating, and then since then, I've been really excited to kind of apply the GTM instincts that I've had from my operating role, not to one product, one market, but to multiple amazing founders and help them get to product market fit. So that's a very quick summary.
Quick but very interesting summary. So technical in education, had a stint as a founder, then as a product manager, I suppose, in GTM and product management roles. Sort of like a big sales roles. Yeah.
But I really enjoy packaging products as well.
Yeah.
But
then at a global large fund as a VC, still a bigger fund, but slightly smaller than Lightspeed at Foundation, and now at a very focused early stage fund, right? So you've seen the different ways of looking at investments and being on the other side of the table from founders at 3 different firms now, which I think is quite interesting. So let's just double click a little bit on Zetta. So many of our listeners may know Zetta. It's an AI first and AI focused firm. What does it mean? Just double click a little bit on if a founder is evaluating a Lightspeed or a Zetta, what's the case for Zetta?
Yeah, I think having been at multi-stage funds, there are benefits of multi-stage funds because you get to see things at scale. I think the benefit of focus is that you, as a focused fund, Zetta has seen the different waves of AI, ML, and data right from the beginning. So we have like a deep bench of like 70 plus portfolio companies across data infrastructure, across AI infrastructure, and across both ML applications or computer vision applications and AI applications today. So that gives us a unique vantage point in terms of like what are the emerging trends from the point of view of these companies as well as the customers that they serve. And we also get to see a lot of talent that moves from like these companies to newer startups that we are investing in. So there's a lot of cross-pollination that happens. So for example, Zach Cass, who is the VP of revenue at Lilt, which is one of our early portfolio companies, was the first head of GTM at OpenAI. And so we see a lot of that talent move around, and a lot of them come from our portfolio companies. But just to give everyone a sense of what Zetta is, Zetta was founded almost a decade back as one of the first funds focused on machine learning and data. At that time, the problem was more around data plumbing and helping companies build models and take them to production. Right now, the problem is not around building models, but commercializing AI. So the problem has changed, the vantage point has changed, but we've kind of seen that entire journey. And it's called Zetta because it's named after a zettabyte of data that crossed the internet around that time frame. It's founded by my partner, Mark Gorenberg, who's been in venture for 3+ decades. And he also wears another hat. He is the chair of MIT. So that kind of gives us unique access to that ecosystem as well. And currently we are really focused on the third wave of AI ML, which is self-supervision, in which we are focused on like 3 core parts of the stack: data infrastructure, AI tools and platforms, and AI native applications. And that's a bird's eye view.
Let me pause you there. So do you call that whole umbrella terms AI self-supervision?
We call it self-supervision because like historically the belief was that if something is supervised plus unsupervised, I think if you use both of those together, you'll get to AGI. I think the realization is very quickly that unsupervised learning doesn't meet that case, and you have to kind of throw a lot of data at a lot of compute and use Transformer as an ecosystem in between to kind of get to a self-supervision mode. And I think that's where we are today. That's how most foundation models are being built today. And I think the question is like, what do you need in that ecosystem to create like full autonomy eventually? And I think those are the things that keep us up at night.
Yeah, that is the multi-trillion-dollar question for the industry, right?
Yeah.
When and how. So I paused you there because I wanted our listeners to sort of also understand who's using what terminology and what you mean by that. And you were laying out 3 areas, particularly within that quest for full autonomy, that you think are investment opportunities. Just let's go back and maybe categorize those, and we'll tease some of those apart.
I think that different funds might have different focus areas, and as a small fund, like we want to be very focused on areas which are asset light, but also drive meaningful returns. And in our opinion, while there is a critical compute layer and there's a critical foundation model layer, and I'm talking about generalized foundation models, we believe those 2 layers are super capital intensive. And while there'll be like big winners over there as well, NVIDIA is already $5 trillion in terms of market cap. And in the foundation model layer, we have so many players now, OpenAI, Anthropic being kind of the 2 major ones. And then there are more open source players coming as well. Like we saw Reflection getting backed more recently. But we want to play in layers that we believe will drive true venture returns for a fund of our size. And for that reason, we are looking at data and infrastructure is one of the layers. And by data infrastructure, just to give everyone a sense, it's the same layer in which Databricks and Snowflake exists, but we're looking at newer primitives that will help support the new AI workloads. So that's one. The second is AI tools and platforms, which is the infrastructure and tooling that developers are using or AI engineers are using to put these models into production. And that's everything from like orchestration to vector databases to evals, governance, and observability. Those are the kind of tools that developers are using. And then the application layer. And within the application layer, you could have applications that are being built on top of existing foundation models. Those could be horizontal or vertical applications. But you could also have vertical applications or domain-specific applications which have to create their own foundation model. We call them full-stack applications. Those are in categories of biochemistry or in material sciences or in robotics, where the data to create those applications just doesn't exist externally. And so you have to like train your own model from scratch to be able to like deliver that application in the market. And so we are also very excited about those full stack applications. And those are the only places where we will make model bets as well, unlike the generalized foundation models.
There's a lot to cover there. So to summarize again, it's data infrastructure, AI infra tooling, and then let's call it full stack applications where there's some model or data advantage.
That is one. Also, we've done applications on top of foundation models as well, and there's a different criteria for that. How we evaluate them.
Yeah, so, that's a pretty vast net. You specifically are specializing in data, and then Zetta over the years has had many interesting data infrastructure plays. I think you guys were in, if I'm not mistaken, Tabular, in Mother Duck. So there's a lot of experience here in that layer. It's not an easy layer, right? You have Snowflake and Databricks that want to eat the world, right? And they want to be the single source and everything for all enterprise data.
Right. Yeah.
So that's on one side. There's the whole dynamics of how do you get scale with anything in that environment when you have two such, big players. And then you have the world of large models, right? Whether it's transformer or whether it's, now emerging neurosymbolic models that are sort of squeezing the importance, I would call it, the importance of enterprise data, where these models are so general purpose but so powerful that what's that incremental 2-3% of training on my very specific sales data is that even needed, right? So in that world of how valuable is this enterprise-specific data, and where sort of, large models of all types of vertical use cases are getting trained, right? So people are training large models on every possible business use case. So I want to get, because you're such a specialized investor and so knowledgeable in this space, this is a question I grappled with. What is the importance of this enterprise data 5 years from now?
Yeah.
Does anyone care? How do you think about it?
When you think of like models improving and capabilities improving and reasoning improving, I think that's definitely one vector which kind of keeps everyone up at night. And whether it's you're in the data layer or you're in the application layer, you're constantly thinking about like what helps you survive. And it's also like we've also seen, right, that the promise of the modern data stack really didn't hold out, because no one wants to wait for like so many tools working together, so many access control layers on different parts of those value chain before you kind of get to your results. And that's why, to a certain extent, there were like a plethora of tools that came into the market. And that's the truth about every infra layer, right? Like whenever a new workload comes in, and initially it was more BI, then it was machine learning, now it's AI. Whenever like a new workload comes in, like there are new specialist tools that come out that help you in different parts of the workflow. And soon then there's consolidation. Same happened with Snowflake as well, where it kind of was very tailored towards BI or analytics use cases, and soon started to like grow into all different kinds of things. The same was true about Databricks, which is like we help you create a unified data infrastructure, which they call Lakehouse at that point in time, and then we'll help you get consumed by machine learning engineers or ML platform teams. And now the question is like, what happens with AI? And honestly, with AI, you don't want a couple of things. Like you don't want your data to be vendor locked in. You want to own your data. I think the challenge with all these platforms till now has been that like they want to own your data. That's why there's this big push towards, can I own my own data in S3 or Hadoop or whatever infrastructure I have? And can you provide me with the tooling on top of it? And to a certain extent, that was one of the promises of Iceberg as well, that like you keep your data in your source. In fact, even if your data is in Snowflake, we'll help like give you open data access, so that like you don't have to like lock your data into any of these platforms. You can own your data and you don't have to store it somewhere else, but we'll provide you with all the primitives needed, right? From cataloging to access controls and everything that a Snowflake provides from a storage perspective. We provide that on top of your existing storage so that you don't have to change your storage. But we'll also give you the flexibility to work with any tool of choice, whether you're working with an AI workflow or whether you're working with analytics tools like Athena or Trino or whatever you may use. Like you should be able to have flexibility to work with any of those tools. So one aspect of it is definitely controlling your data. So like how do you control your data and use it for BI use cases or AI use cases? And I still feel that in the market today, even today, right, analytics is so disconnected from machine learning, and machine learning is so disconnected from AI. And honestly, the best case scenario is that there is a unified runtime where you have data collected from all different sources, whether they are relational or non-relational, whether they are event-based or non-event-based, and you have the right context. They're all fused together, and the same runtime kind of delivers it for a analytics application, or delivers it for a machine learning application, or delivers it for an AI application. Today, all of that are silos. And that's why data infrastructure becomes interesting over here, because most big enterprises would want that centralized. It's not just a structural shift in terms of technology, it's also a structural shift in terms of org structures. That how should org structures within enterprises be to be able to consume data in a multimodal fashion with the right context in place and be able to provide it to analytics, be provided to machine learning, or provided to AI. So I think that's one area that I'm excited about within data infrastructure, which is that unification where you don't need to kind of go to silos. And I think there is a possibility that that could be a standalone platform in the future, which is as big or bigger than Snowflake or Databricks.
Is there an investment there that you have made that you're excited about?
Look, I think none of the companies start as platforms. They start as like entry points. And I think they start unique insight in the market, which is that this is what the users need for that particular use case. And that primitive doesn't exist today. So let's build that primitive. That's how, honestly, even Snowflake and Databricks started.
Right,
they started
very true.
Use cases, but then they became platforms.
Right.
I'm hoping that there becomes a platform like that in the future and not everything gets subsumed by Snowflake or Databricks. We have made investments that help you unbundle your data. And one of those was Iceberg, which got acquired, but the other one is Zetta, where not every data is big data. He talks about the power of small data, where you can keep the data in your S3, but you can like convert your local machine, like your computer, into an analytics engine. And you should be able to like use it as good as Postgres and capabilities on top of Postgres.
You're saying the quantum of data, the fragmentation of the data, the organizational siloing of people working with the data is still so vast. There are huge opportunities to both, internally streamline the data access, the usage, and ultimately perhaps as a single runtime layer that just unifies all access and all runtime.
That's one big opportunity. The other big opportunity is and that opportunity honestly exists with incumbents as well. If you think of Labelbox and this, they started with human in the loop, labeling ops, but a lot of them have the ability to kind of get into synthetic data. They have the ability to get into not just generating net new data, but also curating existing data. Because one of the things about the last mile in any application is because any application company only becomes defensible over time. It doesn't become defensible on day zero. And the way it becomes defensible over time is when you have those closed feedback loops internally. And the way you get to closed feedback loops is once you are embedded in a workflow, you collect more and more user behavior data and how people think, how they work, how they do their job. And based on that, you just make the last mile as effective as possible. And sometimes you have people in the loop, but many times the hope is everything runs in full autonomy mode in the future. So that last mile, even if models become better for different domains, even if you don't train your own models, you would need that last mile. And that last mile only works if you build not what model eval is, but for data. Like what does evaluating data means? What does curating data mean for those use cases? And I think there is a business to be built on that side as well, where whether it's like generating net new data or curating existing data, not for training purposes, because there's been a lot of push on training, but more on the inference side.
Absolutely. Right.
There's a lot to be done on that side.
But the last mile to be effective, you need that context, and which means your organizational data. Agreed. So just one other question on this whole data layer: how important is open source as a business model still in that world? Question one. And two, do you evaluate open source metrics any differently today than, say, pre-LLMs?
Yeah, I think the benefit of open source always has been the fact that if you have technical users, whether they are data scientists or application engineers or data engineers, if there are any technical folks who are personally struggling with an issue, which is not a collaboration issue, but a personal issue, then you could potentially use an open source tool or an IC. And open source tools are best for ICs because they can really help solve your personal problems. And the only way commercial solutions work on top is either by building better collaboration, better security, or by selling to an adjacent buying center where there is a real problem to be solved. And we've seen many of those situations as well, where open source has been built for applied data scientists, but the ML platform teams end up being kind of the buying houses. The benefit of open source has always been that you are able to find users in the wild. If there is a problem that exists for an IC, then open source just helps you find users in the wild. That doesn't mean those same users are paying. It just shows that there is trust in that organization that whatever that company that manages the open source builds, there will be bottoms up evangelism within the company, and that's always helped, at least in the infrastructure side. But that doesn't always have to happen. Like, I think it shouldn't be a force fit where if I'm an open source practitioner and I'm now deciding to start a company around it, that has been an interesting way of building companies. Or in case of Mother Duck, it's been that someone else has built this open source, but we can kind of build something interesting on top of it, which is a good case study that Mother Duck has put together. But I think if you use open source as a GTM mechanism, I don't know how effective that is, because I haven't seen that work out so far. So it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be like, oh, I'm already doing open source for the benefit of ICs. Now let's see what we can do as a commercial product on top. Otherwise, you could always sell something, put something out in the freemium in the wild, and see how people adopt it.
So you're saying, the evaluation criteria really hasn't changed that much from, it's pretty much the same reasons why you would still open source, and then as a pure business model, that's a hard one. Okay, agree with you. But I ask the questions because you guys have a couple of very successful companies or that have done well with that model, right? We talk.
Big question with open source is like there's so many companies or so many open source projects that have so much meaningful traction. The question is like, which kind of open source projects can evolve into commercial and meaningful companies? I think that goes back to your thesis around like how the market trend's changing, and which open source tools fall squarely within that market trend. That can really benefit from that market trend. Not every open source tool does that, even though they have massive amounts of adoption. It doesn't mean that can be a business around it.
That's right. The vanity metrics may not lead to an actual business.
Right. That's right.
Right. Yeah. Okay, great. So let's shift gears a little bit here. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the application layer here. And you talked about, both applications wrapping around large models or full stack apps being of interest.
Right.
Zetta, just double click that a little bit more. Maybe you can give us a couple of examples. That's obviously an area where a lot of VCs are investing.
Yeah.
It's an area that's easier to understand. But give us a few examples of how you're doing it, if you're doing it differently, if you're evaluating differently.
Yeah.
How do you look at these companies?
Versus horizontal versus vertical on existing foundation.
Yeah, let's maybe explain what you mean by full stack to our listeners here.
And I can explain with an example, right? Like in the bio and life sciences space, we've done a lot of full stack investments. And by full stack, we mean that you can't build that application on top of the models being built by OpenAI and Anthropic. So, for example, there's a company called Nabla Bio in our portfolio, which is designing antibodies for pharma companies. And a big part of designing antibodies is kind of doing a lot of brute force work on protein structures and protein sequences. And historically, a lot of this work was manual in nature. And the benefit of models is that you can look at a lot of protein sequences and which can kind of output a lot of protein sequences that are aligned to kind of designing useful antibodies. And so we realized that kind of distinction. And very early back in 2020, when this team was back in George Church's lab, they had kind of published a paper in Nature where they'd spoken about like how if you apply the same transformer model, this was like early GPT, pre-GPT days, but the transformer model was still there. So they applied this concept of protein sequences, which is still like very similar to like natural language, because protein structures are like AB in nature, which is like natural language. So they applied that same protein sequences to the transformer model to get a certain kind of, and designed a certain kind of antibodies. And that was very interesting. And that was just more theoretical at that point in time. And so we followed their journey from there, and also like collaborated closely, helped connect them to a bunch of pharma and biopharma companies, and co-led the seed round with Khosla back in the day. And since then, they built a full stack application where they are generating protein sequences. And now protein sequences are not just two-dimensional, they are three-dimensional in nature. So it's become more like a multimodal model now. But it started off with like a two-dimensional structure where they were generating that in the wet lab, and they were training their own model. And using that own model, they were actually taking the outputs to pharma companies And now they kind of have this full stack application, and they have working with like some of the top pharma companies. And that's an example of a full stack application where you just can't build that application without that base foundation model. But that's a very domain specific foundation model that the company had to build.
Yeah, a domain specific, a lot of proprietary data moat there, and perhaps regulatory moat as well.
A catalog where you don't have to take it to pharma, but you can also like go directly to IND as well. So if you're able to like identify these unique like structures yourself, then you should be able to predict not just antibodies, but also you should be able to predict like molecules and other kinds of things that you can actually take directly to IND. And that could be a new phase for biotech, where you're actually generating drugs from scratch, and not even going to pharma.
Right. So the company started with an existing sort of understood use case, built a solution that was very built on sort of proprietary data, and now they're opening up possibilities that did not exist before. And that's a true power of AI, as in doing drug development from scratch. Very interesting. So that's an easy one to understand. There's a moat here, there's data moat, there's regulatory moat.
Right.
What about sort of your run-of-the-mill vertical application company that's getting started every day, where all investors are struggling, but where exactly is the intelligence? Isn't that in the underlying models? And what's the defensibility? Is it pure execution? Is it just walk us through how you're thinking about these non-full stack applications?
Yeah, historically it used to take like a long time to build a product. I think it's become the product development life cycles have shortened. So the benefit of that is that you can actually test out some of those things. At least you can put up an MVP and start testing that out, which used to take like longer time earlier. Now, because you have access to models, you have access to like tools like cursors and replets of the world, you should be able to like code things faster and take them to market faster. So I think we're looking a lot at not just what pain points you're solving and what team you have, and it's also not only the GTM ideas that you had, but also like, have you already built what you're talking about? Or have you like cobbled together some version of what you're talking about? And what are the kind of customers that you've spoken to, or who has seen it? And when you think of like a business model around it, you think of a business model which is tool first. Is it like a copilot model? Is it an agentic model? Is it an agency model? Because there's a big distinction between like copilots, agents, and agencies. Agencies being more like where you're actually controlling that entire business workflow. And most tools honestly don't do the job 100%. So the question for most founders is like, do we launch the tool in the wild, help the tool improve? And I think that's where kind of the thinking comes in, right? Like, how is the founder thinking about improving the product? Or is the founder thinking about capturing the wallet share right from the beginning? And will it always be an outcomes-based business, or will it be a product-based business at any point in time? So I think if anyone has nuanced thoughts around that and has mental models around that, I think that really helps. But at the end of the day, the two things that really matter in businesses over time, at least in the agentic layer or the application layer, whether they are horizontal or vertical, built on top of existing foundation models, is whether like you've figured out a way to not just be like a abstraction or like a adjacent to the workflow, but the workflow itself. And secondly, have you figured out over time how to own bits of the data flywheel? Because we spoke about the data flywheel before, where a lot of organizations have internal data. So if you apply, let's say in the coding space, I give you an example, right? You have a company called Curie AI, which is founded by the person who created Hive at Facebook. And then after that, he was founder of Chibol, which was acquired, and then was the GM of SageMaker. And his idea was that like the entire workflow around designing and implementing IT integrations that come alongside Salesforce or SAP and so on, a lot of that work is heavily outsourced to SIs. And that's very manual work. It's a very manual workflow. There's an existing budget to it, but it's always done in terms of projects. So, and you have to always reinvent the flywheel around like if something gets updated, or if something is broken, or if a new product gets introduced. So how do you automate that? So you created a fleet of agents. Now think of them as like coding agents, but coding agents, let's say if you focused on the MuleSoft ecosystem, because he started to like think like platform by platform and MuleSoft was the first big platform that he thought about. All the integrations adjacent to the MuleSoft ecosystem are being managed by system integrators. Now, if you throw like a Cursor or a Claude Code or whatever, because those are coding agents as well, to the same problem, even though the coding agents have become so much better, the accuracy of those integrations is 20% or 30%, despite better reasoning, despite better models. Versus in their case, since they are building it for the data ontology for kind of they using the internal data flywheels of these organizations, these coding agents that they've built, they are 90% accuracy. Now that doesn't, now the other question in their heads is, should we just like launch it as a tool, or should we launch it as an agency, which makes them an SI themselves? And I think when founders kind of think about things in such a nuanced way, that's what gives you comfort that maybe today there is no defensibility because it's hard to assess defensibility in these things. One is like one arc of this is that the founders are great, but then these are the kind of questions you should be asking so that you know that there will be defensibility in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, just implicit in a couple of the terms that you used copilot versus agent versus agency model. You're using, workflow. Implicit in all of that is that sort of SaaS, maybe, let me not put words in your mouth. SaaS as we know it, which is build once, sell many, many times, is that dead? Is that dead? Is that model pretty much dead?
I don't think it's dead. I think SaaS stands for something deterministic, right? And there is a part of everyone's workflow which is deterministic. There's a lot of data entry workflow in every function. Like take the CRM, for example. I don't think the CRM is dead today.
But you're defining this application in the new world, post-LLM. Let's call it the agentic world that we live in today, right? So application today by you, Zetta, is being defined, and many others, by the way, and us included, is being defined really as what used to be called workflow automation. Now we're taking pieces and pieces of it.
That's right.
And it's taking a layer of, and the interface, the user interface is being completely reimagined. We really don't know what it's going to be.
That's right.
Is it voice, is it chat? But underneath it, it's some kind of an automation of what used to be a human workflow.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That is what we're calling the new AI application layer today.
Because that can't be addressed by SaaS, which was one size fits all. Right. And we don't want to invest in agentic applications if it should exist only if AI exists. We don't want to go down the path of replacing SaaS today, because that's a losing proposition. The SaaS stands for something, or is being used for something which is deterministic. And I think let them do the work in that deterministic way. Maybe once you change the interface of the workflow adjacent to that SaaS product, and if that's the user interface eventually, then slowly you can eat away the SaaS use case as well. But I think that'll happen in the medium to long term. It wouldn't.
Yeah, you just took my next question, which is who eats who? So this automation eventually really gets rid of those deterministic use cases. That could be one possibility, right? So what would your advice be to your older portfolio companies that may be SaaS companies, and say, it's going to get harder and harder for them to raise money, right? Because VCs have moved on to agentic workflows, and that's why I use the provocative term is SaaS dead. Capital raising gets harder.
Right.
What do you do? What's your advice to those companies?
So the good thing is that if you think of Zetta's portfolio, right, there's either infrastructure companies, AI infrastructure companies like Domino, or collaboration companies like Kaggle, which has now been acquired, or computer vision companies like Lil.
Okay, let's maybe not, you don't have a lot of SaaS applications. Let me ask another question. What do the data science platforms up yesterday do, right?
I think different layers will have different strategies. I think companies like Domino, for example, they started off as model management companies for data scientists, where you have to train the model and deploy the model. I think they'll have to evolve into an ecosystem where they're not just focused on models on structured data, but they're also incorporating LLMs in the mix, because people are not just using structured data or classical ML models. They are also using LLMs now for different use cases, and they need platforms to manage those as well. So one is kind of expanding the aperture, and which is what Databricks did, right? So the acquisition of Mosaic ML, where now you train your LLMs too. That was their way of kind of expanding that use case. But the other thing that these platform companies can do is they have the best vantage point to get into eval and governance, because they have that early first mile distribution benefit where they have the trust of the organization that the other companies that are helping us train our models and launch our models, and now, by the way, they're also like helping us plug in LLMs as well. Maybe they can also help us in governance. They can also help us in like evaluating these models. And as anyone who does that well will have the right to remain in the market. And because there are a lot of point solutions out there. I think the other question is like, what do computer vision companies do? I think computer vision companies historically have had a benefit of having great perception models. They've built computer vision for different use cases. They can adapt to multimodality where they can kind of have text in the mix as well. For example, Vidya Health, which is selling to dentistry, is doing analysis, computer vision analysis on like images, your tooth images that are being taken in dental clinics. There is a lot of workflow on the adjacent to that, where there is a lot of summarization needed, like those reports have to be sent out internally. You could potentially use like reasoning LLMs around that in addition to computer vision. So I think they'll have to like diversify for sure, but at least those companies have something to latch on to. If they don't do it well, then there is definitely, they'll be in the old world versus kind of the new world, and also the world that's about to come.
That's right. And maybe also sort of just burn appropriately, right? Because capital raising is going to get harder and harder until they can show whatever we want to call it, the expanded strategy. So we live in interesting times, which, and we've seen these platform shifts. We as venture investors like platform shifts, but they come at a cost, which is if the shift is happening really fast, then you can end up with a set of portfolio companies that are sort of struggling to adapt and change to the new world. So with that, we just talked about, what some of these older AI ML companies could be doing. For example, you addressed it well. That's probably a good segue to my next question, which is, so how are you thinking about, and I'm asking this of all my VC friends, how are you thinking about portfolio construction today? In this world of, shifting, it's like sand shifting in some ways, right?
I think we've kind of revisited portfolio construction multiple times, given like how the market has shifted. I think we still believe that there is a lot of merit in discipline. There's so many companies raising massive rounds. And so you do feel like, you might not be in the mix of some of those companies, but some of them are capital intensive truly, and some of them are not, but they are raising based promise. So the way we kind of constructed our portfolio now is that like around 80 to 85% of the portfolio would still be focused on core check. So the core check is anywhere from like 2 to 4 mil, where the ownership would be anywhere from like 5 to 15%. We've definitely expanded the aperture of our ownership, which used to be mostly 10 to 15%. Now it's like 5 to 15%, but we still prefer around 10% ownership, where we're kind of co-leading rounds. But some rounds are honestly bigger, and so we are thinking of like those 5% positions as well in those rounds. And those are not that crazy rounds, but they're still like 10 to 15 mil kind of rounds. But then we have like 15% of the portfolio that we've reserved for investing in some of the best teams, irrespective of the price, just because we want to be in the orbit of some of the best founders. And in that case, we are not, since it's like 10 to 15% of the fund, we are trying to maximize the number of companies and number of teams, amazing teams that we work with. So at best, we would put like maybe up to 2 mil in one company, but it's kind of a smaller check strategy in that bucket. But it's still very disciplined, around 5 to 15% and around 25 to 30 shots on goal.
Right. 25 to 30 shots on goal. Okay. And is that different from prior funds, the 25 to 30?
I think prior funds, given they were almost in the same zip code, there were fewer shots on goal. And I think we need to have more shots on goal.
So
and
slightly higher shots on goals.
Definitely.
Stay with the, higher ownership, core ownership strategy, but at the same time, don't be afraid to take, be in some of the companies that everyone wants to be. Those are, right, to have exposure to things that may just be breakouts where you may have a small ownership, but it's a huge outcome.
Other changes in the reserve strategy, where we are, because there are more shots on goal, it's not 1:1 reserves, proactively thinking about like where to double down, where not to double down, and where to proactively also exit at the right time. Because not every company, you don't have to be on the cap table of every company till perpetuity, or till whenever you get the liquidity. So it's also that decision making in our minds, which is actually fair for ILPs and for those in our orbit.
Yeah, and it's also sort of, I think, earlier stage investors have that optionality, to sell partly or selectively at future rounds without sort of creating any signaling issues or cap table issues, right? So that this has all been very exciting. I think we think similarly. So a lot of your answers made a lot of sense, and I learned a lot from this conversation. Just to sort of give our listeners and me, so a peek into what's interesting, exciting in this new world of AI in terms of infrastructure investing. Do you want to talk about one or two? Maybe we can wrap up with one or two examples of recent investments. And if they're in stealth, you don't need to mention the name.
Yeah, I think we were talking about this before we started recording. One of our more recent investments is an open source foundation model, but it's very domain specific. So it's not, again, a generalized foundation model. It's called Bolts. It came out of MIT, and we invested in the company a few months back. It's an open source model for biomolecular design. When by biomolecular design, I'd given you the example of like, how do you do like antibody design using Nabla? And like in that case, you're kind of working with an external vendor. In this case, like any pharma company could adopt this open source model, and they could kind of develop that application internally themselves. And the exciting part about Bolts is that it's launched like literally very recently. It's been, I would say, like almost a year since it's launched, and it's become one of the most popular models for biomolecular design.
Very exciting. So you're giving the power of drug design using AI to pharma companies.
That's right.
Correctly. Yeah. Exciting times.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been very, very enjoyable for me and hopefully for our listeners. And good to see you. And thank you for doing this call, and wishing you many more exciting investments ahead. I hope to have you back and talk about some of them in the future.
Thank you, Nilanjana. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Apoorva.